I've pulled up the YouTube on the other screen here. So.
Okay. Great. Good afternoon and happy Pride Month. Thank you for participating in this public conversation on LGBTQ resiliency in the age of COVID, sponsored by the Tompkins County Office of Human Rights. I am Ken Clark, director of this office. We promoted this event as a multi-generational conversation which welcomes the diversity of the LGBTQ plus community and its allies. Thanks to legislators Annie Corman and Shauna Black, and also Kate Shanks-Booth and Dominic Recchio for helping plan today's event. Before we begin, I want to mention that we have 11 LGBTQ plus themed items to raffle. All raffle items include a goodie bag with rainbow bracelets, desktop pride flags, microfiber cloths for glasses, posters, an LGBTQ plus history summary, and very importantly, candy. 6 of these include rainbow umbrellas. The other 5 include 1969 writing journals. 1969, of course, denotes the Stonewall Rebellion. To enter the raffle, we ask that you please submit your email address in the YouTube chat where you will find a Google Forms sheet. We will gather these emails and then make random selections. At the end of our program, which will end no later than 1:15, we will announce the winners. Winners will be able to pick up their rewards beginning today from the Office of Human Rights at 120 West Martin Luther King Jr. Street or State Street. We are open from 8:30 to 4:30, Monday through Friday. And as you begin to submit your email addresses, we just wanted to speak a word about this program. Our intent is to invite a diverse audience across generations to share their experiences during this pandemic. How did you seek, find, or struggle to find community? How did you find resources for resiliency? What did resiliency mean to you? In the context of a pandemic, a national racial reckoning, and xenophobic attacks on Asian and Asian Americans, how did communities of color who are LGBTQ plus seek or experience resiliency? These are some of the questions we want to engage in during this hour. To moderate the discussion, I've asked 2 distinguished colleagues to join us. Kate Shanks-Booth, Director of Tompkins County Youth Services, and Hierald Osorto, Ithaca College's Executive Director for Student Equity and Belonging, and Director of the Office of Religious and Spiritual Life. Hierald is also a vicar at St. Luke's Lutheran Church in Collegetown. A vicar in the Lutheran tradition is a candidate for ordained pastoral ministry. St. Luke's is a member congregation of the Evangelical Lutheran Church of America, which over the last 3 decades has become increasingly welcoming and inclusive of LGBTQ plus members, whether laypersons or clergy. Kate and Hierald, the floor is yours.
Hello. Hi, Kate.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm all right on this Friday afternoon. How are you?
I'm doing okay. It's beautiful outside. It was 50 a couple days ago, so I'm glad the weather has warmed up, and it's more the summertime I think we're used to here in Ithaca. So it's good.
So we have a few questions that we wanted to ask, but I'm wondering, maybe we can kind of start off with kind of talking about what our experience has been during these last 15 months.
Sure, yeah, I think that's a great idea.
And then we'll open up the floor for those that are on the YouTubes.
Sounds great. Great. Well, I'll start. I'll ask you the first question. How's that?
Okay, I can go with it.
Sure. So how did you find community during the pandemic?
That's a good question. I think one, I had to rethink what community was, right? So pre-pandemic, community was a very physical experience. for me. So it was gathering with people in person on a regular basis, and then COVID, right? And so that was no longer possible. And I found myself drawn to connecting with people that I, over time, had maintained a relationship with, but were separated by distance and by place. And then that became my community during the pandemic, right? So I was able to reconnect with folks that I have lamented not having nearby because of a move to upstate New York from Texas. And I was finally able to rekindle that ongoing relationship with them. And so over time, we developed practices that connected us on a regular basis, right? So whether that was, I feel early on in the pandemic, we were really into happy hours. Like it was a thing that we did over Zoom. That got old after a while. I'm like, I'm done. I don't want to see you. But there was a sustained weekly ritual of some sort that brought us together that I could find outside of the place where I live now. And so I'm really grateful for that. So yeah, how did you find community during this time, during the pandemic?
Well, it was a challenge. It was difficult at the beginning. I think it was finding that equilibrium and of the new way of being in the world with the virtual Zoom being the main connector. I'm originally from Missouri, so I the video chatting and the FaceTiming with family back there was something that I continued to do and had done before. So in that sense, I was good with that. But I have some really good friends that, like I didn't see for over a year in person because of, we weren't vaccinated. And so we, like you, sort of use Zoom and FaceTime and just set up, was it the happy hours, had some like dinners virtually. It was interesting, especially even on holidays, right? So doing Friendsgiving over, Zoom. So you were eating with people. It was really, being sort of an extrovert in some senses. I'm not a huge extrovert, but I do get a lot from being with friends and family, and it means a lot to me. It kind of recharges me. So it was difficult, but I think we made do. And I'm glad we're sort of getting back to normal life as far as like being able to see people again. So
absolutely. Yeah, I do wonder if in a year from now, if I will maintain some of those virtual encounters. I'm uncertain right now. I think I will, but there's a part of me of like, oh, I think I need a break as well. But we'll see. We'll see how community manifests now that we go back into other ways of interacting with each other.
Yeah, no, the communications and the good old just person conversations, I think, are just they're much more meaningful, right? Because we now no longer take them for granted. So, was there anyone that's watching us that would like to chime into the conversation and let us know how maybe you and yours found your community through this pandemic, through this time?
Give the folks on YouTube just a moment to type anything in. I'll paste the questions there too, so they can see as we go. I'll share them back with you.
Great. Maybe while we wait, I'll ask another question, Kate.
Sure.
Given sort of our conversation around how we found community, what does community mean for you now? As a concept, as a term?
I didn't come out until my 30s, and so I've always been really blessed to have really great relationships. No matter what my status was as far as like being public or not. But over the last 10 years, 10, 12 years at this point, community is really just, they become family, right? They're the people that show up when you need them. They're the people that you have Friendsgiving with. They're the people that you call, that you hang out with, right? And so it just really gives you a place where you can breathe, be safe. And for me, it's like it's the staples and supports that make life worth it for me, right? Those relationships are really, really important. I was, So yes, in people, but I was also thinking just now that, like I have a couple of dogs, right? And so like over the pandemic, they really, I mean, I know that a lot of people got dogs over the pandemic or other animals too, but I think, we would be remiss not to give a nod to the four-legged friends in our lives that I think helped a lot of people make it through the pandemic as well. So, I think that was of interest. Do you have a dog yourself? Do you have any animals?
I do. I have a small miniature poodle. His name is Alfie, and we rescued him last summer, late
Gotcha.
July, early August. I get the dates mixed up. Prior to that, Freddie was our other dog, and he
Okay.
died in July, and we were not expecting to get another rescue, but the SPCA called us. I think we're on a list somewhere for liking senior dogs because
Gotcha.
Freddie was
Okay.
also a senior dog. But definitely
Gotcha. Okay.
pets play a role in that concept of community.
Yeah. So it looks like we had someone say that they had continued to work through the pandemic, but they found deeper relationships with their coworkers and those regular in-person conversations. I think that does that resonate with you? I think that's a really good point. How did your definition of community change, or what does it mean to you now? And maybe in light of that comment about coworkers.
That actually it's a good way of framing kind of what happened in some cases. So like I would relate with that in terms of I now have deeper relationships with colleagues that I probably would not have interacted with as regularly as I did during these last 15 plus months, like to the point of there's texting exchanges that happen. And I don't know that was necessarily the norm for me prior to the pandemic. So my concept of community has definitely expanded to include folks from work. I think the other part of the community concept is kind of the interaction of community with place, right? So I'm not from upstate New York. We moved here from Austin, Texas, and live in Hector, which is about 35 to 40 minutes from Ithaca, New York. It's a little bit more rural, and it's full of wineries. But one thing that I did notice is that during the pandemic, the way that I noticed and paid attention to my neighbors looked differently than had I maintained sort of the regular trajectory of going into Ithaca and coming back really late at night. I started to notice my neighbors in this community. And so that has also expanded community in terms of place of where I live, physically live. And so I'm thankful for that. I think that also just every once in a while, my spouse is a Presbyterian minister, and the congregation is literally across the street from our house. But every once in a while, we would find things outside of our house, right? Like someone picked a flower and just left it on the car, or someone was like, "Here's some stuff to make bread," and they just left it on the door, right? So like even though we weren't seeing people, who they were and how they cared showed up during this time. And so community became that too.
Yeah, no, it really has taken on a deeper meaning in a lot of ways, I think, for a lot of people. So, and interestingly enough, even some of the intergenerational, right? I know the experiences for people of different ages can be a little bit different, but I think this was sort of leveled the playing field, right? In ways that, we hadn't seen before. So that's good. So someone asked in the chat, how did I survive without the dog park? So Rucker is a 10-month-old black lab, and he is absolutely, I love him. He's very handsome. It's a good thing he's handsome, I tell him, because he's a pain, but I do love him. And then Stella will be 11 in July, and I'm lucky enough to live on a farm where I was able to buy a chucket, and we play a lot of fetch. So that's how we survived the pandemic. So. Let's see. So there's another question. Are there ways that the COVID-19 pandemic brought the AIDS epidemic to mind? Good question. Yeah.
Good question.
I'd be curious if anyone else had any thoughts on that in the YouTube.
Yeah.
In the YouTube community that's watching.
I think, and this is actually something that I was just recently talking to my spouse about, is that the COVID-19 pandemic has led me to try to learn more about that moment in history. Um, I feel disconnected from it somehow because I didn't live. I'm not someone that lived through that era, and my elders who come before me that have a different resonance with that experience of the AIDS epidemic and the COVID pandemic. So for me, it's reawakened sort of a curiosity, but also an interest of learning more and honoring kind of my forebears, right? In terms of the folks that laid the ground in different ways, and who showed resiliency during a very difficult time that was disheartening and heartbreaking. And I recently came across this article about an MCC minister, the Metropolitan Community Church minister in San Francisco, who talked about his particular experience in San Francisco during the height of the AIDS epidemic, and the power of staying for him, right, as a minister during a time where, he would see folks on the streets walking with their IV poles, right, and like just you could feel the sense of gloom and just pain and heartbreak, and he stayed. And so those are the kinds of things that I've been led to during this time. But yeah, I'm curious of others. How about you, Kate? Anything on your end?
I was just thinking, I was young at that time. I don't think I was necessarily old enough to really understand the scope of what was happening and how that was shaping the world that we lived in at the time. I remember there being a lot of fear, right? I remember parents talking about different things and the fear of how that may be transmitted and what that did in the isolation that created for people. And how, in a lot of the same ways, the COVID-19 pandemic did the same thing, right? Especially early on, right? We didn't know how necessarily it was transmitted. We knew that it moved from person to person, but what we could do to keep ourselves safe, just the panic, right? And the absolutely upheaval. And I think, in a lot of ways, because COVID isn't, and just like the AIDS pandemic, it wasn't a respecter of persons, socioeconomic status, diversity. It didn't matter. If it hit you, it didn't matter. It didn't matter who you were, what you believed, how much income you had, you now had this thing. And so I think that it is a good reminder of not only what's important, but also that we have to remember that just because something might be, I won't say foreign or not necessarily something we're familiar with, especially when it's other people suffering, that our job is really, as a community, is to make sure that we're embracing that and supporting in the best ways we possibly can, especially during those times of fear, because fear is the thing that isolates us, right? And those relationships are so important. And I think COVID has taught us that, at least me. So, yeah.
Anything from the YouTube realm? I don't think I've seen. I was able to get it open, so I haven't seen anything come through the chat.
Yeah, not yet. See, let's, I think maybe we kind of talked about this with dogs a little bit, but what helped you with your resiliency through the pandemic?
What helped me through the resiliency? I think for me, it was sort of my day-to-day, right? And being able to create practices that sustained me on a regular basis, whether that was a walk, or coffee in the morning, right? Like the day-to-day things that sustain one. I think I would also name my parents. So my parents didn't have the ability, because of their socioeconomic employment status, to work from home. My parents were considered essential workers and had to continue to go into work every single day. And so there was a heightened fear, in terms of them being susceptible to getting COVID, which they ended up getting COVID. But I just remember one of my early conversations with my mother, who just was able to frame for me this moment in a particular way that I found astounding, which was in light of, she was talking about taking a break. And I was like, wait, what? How are you taking a break? But she was able to name that as a necessary piece of her own trajectory, because she's like, I can't sustain what I'm doing right now every single day if I don't take a week off at least. And so she took a week to make face masks for people. And so that for me was, I think, a really important moment in my time during COVID to be reminded of the resilience within my community in particular, right? My community is a community of immigrants. And so my parents, I think, played a big role in that. But how about you?
Yeah, I like I said, I was lucky enough to have I had a roommate during that time, so I didn't have to, I think it wasn't by myself. I think people who lived by themselves and don't have that partner, or don't have that person in the house to sort of talk to, it was pretty isolating. But really, the dogs and just finding ways to reach out and keep connected, once you sort of readjusted to what the new norm was really. I think that's really what helped. Just people caring. You mentioned the face mask. I know that we had Bridget Nugent is the deputy director of Tompkins County Youth Services, and she headed up the county's response to a bunch of volunteers that came up to, I believe it was TST BOCES, and they made masks, right, and they distributed those in the community. And so it was those small acts of kindness. People randomly all over Tompkins County were making them and then donating them. And so it was just, I think, coming back to the realization of our humanity and that connects us was really humbling, but also really, it was really powerful, and, keeps you going and reminds you of why we do the work that we do, right? Dr. Clark had put some things, he said that he had lived in San Francisco, and I was just wondering if we were talking about, how the AIDS pandemic may have overlapped and reminded us, COVID may have reminded us of that. Dr. Clark, do you have any thoughts that you wanted to share and jump in?
Sure. I was an assistant pastor in San Francisco at Third Baptist Church, a historic Black congregation from 1987 to 90 at the height of the AIDS crisis. And I think, one of the parallels I see in, between that time and now is the sense, in particular in the way in which it was impacting the LGBT community, was the way in which there was this struggle against this pervasive disease in a moment in which it was difficult to see any end in sight, although there was a great deal of agency being exercised in the LGBT community in terms of education, in terms of activism, particularly in terms of really pushing, for instance, the federal government to acknowledge the reality of the struggle. You literally, you had in the White House a president who for nearly 8 years said, very little, if anything, about AIDS as a public health crisis. And so I think, in the parallels, you could frankly draw the parallels there between that in the lack of attention given by the previous administration to this pandemic and not taking it seriously. It kind of parallels in a certain way the kind of obliviousness that the Reagan administration exhibited. I think too, what impressed me was the agency and the humanity of the LGBT community, from whom I learned a great deal. We had members of our congregation who were gay and lesbian, and I officiated several of their funerals at the church, as well as in local funeral homes in San Francisco. And this is where it really came home, because, but it was also the place where you had cutting edge research taking place, and cutting edge activism occurring, in a community that was determined to stand this down, and so this, I think those are the things that come to mind when I think about what I saw over 30 years ago and experienced, in what I see happening now. I mean, and as things did begin in rates in terms of AIDS cases began to diminish in the LGBT community. We did see some relative, I would say, if not an end in sight, certainly a way in which to kind of diminish the impact on the community. I mean, I think whereas in our case here, we see some light at the end of the tunnel in relation to the COVID.
Yeah. I think the one thing, Dr. Clark, that you said was the politicalization, right, of
Yes.
people's humanity, right, and the suffering and the amount of people that have passed away. I think that honestly was probably one of the hardest challenges for me, and finding in those in my community, right, having to sort of deal in that world. And so I think looking back, they say hindsight's 20/20, but it really it gives a good perspective looking back and really, again, just understanding that humanity that connects us is,
Yes.
we need to remember that we're all human, right?
That's right.
Regardless of what we may look like. And it's when we come together as a community and support each other, I think that's when we give each other grace. I think that is when we truly see the best in ourselves and other people. So
yeah. And that was something that really hit home for me personally, as well as ministerially. I mean, some of the people I funeralized or whose funerals I attended were friends. And that's when it really, it hits home in a whole nother way.
Yeah, no. Let's see. Is there any lessons that maybe one of the questions is, what did we learn from this going forward? We kind of talked about, remembering the humanity in all of this, but was there anything in particular that maybe some people out there watching YouTube took away, things that they learned, or, and I'll also open up the question to you two gentlemen, if there's anything that you would want to share.
Yeah. Lessons learned. Things are worth trying, and thinking outside of the box is a good thing. I would hope that we all in some way have had to do that during this time, and I think that generates possibilities in ways that we probably would have never imagined, right, before all of this. I think the other thing that I would name as a learning is that we have a long way to go as a country in regards to the ways we think and support and memorialize the contributions of underrepresented populations that live at the intersections of their identities. And I know, it became very blatant during the pandemic, right? It became blatant in regards to who was being affected by the pandemic. It became a political, right, position that just was in your face day in and day out. And so for me, like, I live at that intersection in different ways, and I knew that, but like, I really, really, really knew it then during the pandemic. And so I think the learning is, how can I play a role in continuing to build particular communities that represent the beauty of these intersecting identities, right? And I think, and that may go into some of the other questions that we're going to be asking, but I was reflecting on even like the George Floyd Memorial, right? That as a space, as a sacred space that gathered and continues to gather people's experiences, people's hopes, people's laments. So another learning is, what are the kinds of spaces that we have in our community that hold that sacredness, right? That hold that place that ritualizes who we are and celebrates who we are. So I think that I would name that as a learning of we have work to do in creating more of those intentional spaces in our communities, particularly in upstate New York. But how about you, Kate? Anything on?
A couple of things come to mind. I think the other one is, not everyone's experience is different, and people walk through life differently, right? And some people have very different experience than me. And just because something doesn't happen to me doesn't mean it's not my problem. And so the use of my voice, holding space, sort of what you were saying, for people to use my privilege, to use whatever it may be. And we all have different types of privileges in different settings, but to be able to utilize that and leverage that to bring attention to topics, to force those conversations in places that may be uncomfortable, and to make sure that we're supporting, right? And we're supporting openly, our brothers and sisters that are in the community, and creating space and understanding that everyone has a right to have a voice in that space, right? And so I think that was challenging. Maybe in a less serious thing for me too, working with youth, one of the things I heard from providers, we'd go out and we'd talk to them that were open during the pandemic. The youth were, a lot of times you hear like, oh, we can't get them off their computers, right? They don't want to go outside. They're all, the socialization isn't happening. They don't go outside and ride bikes and hang out and use their imaginations like they used to. But what I heard over and over and over again from the youth professionals in Tompkins County was that the kids just were so grateful to be back, right? And so in the laughter, Renee Borgella is one of our colleagues that works for the health department. And he said, when he would go visit camps last summer in a time when there wasn't a lot of camps, right, there, because of the health restrictions, he'd pull up and he'd hear those children laughing, and it gave him hope for that. It's one of the things he said in one of our task force meetings so I think laughter, right? Laughing is important, and thoroughly enjoying the connection, right? And remembering that being in nature, there's so many things that can give us resiliency. And I think that's another thing, but laughter is good for the soul. It heals a lot. So, that's something that I learned, is not to take myself so seriously, and to know that, if we're lucky enough to be here, we should make sure that we're capitalizing on our relationships. So, yeah. Dr. Clark, did you have anything that you learned in particular that you wanted to maybe throw in?
Well, one of the things, is listen to you and Gerald make comments. I think the importance of memorializing spaces, coupled with really creating space, also personal space for ourselves, whether particularly whether LGBT community members, whether allies, to take a moment during this as we move through this pandemic to mourn. This was a conversation that we had with some nonprofit leaders we gathered with yesterday evening, Kate and I did. And that to create that space in our frenetic, nonstop culture, a culture which is sort of symbolized by our 24/7, news cycle. But a time to sort of step back in order to re-enter. That is very important, I think. And I don't know the extent to which many people have either had time or space to do it, or even, thought to do it. But I think that's really important. It reminds me in some ways of something that Cornell initiated several years ago when I was the director of Cornell United Religious Work. And in fact, our office was involved in this to some extent, in which there was this focus on creating these reflective spaces on campus. In a campus culture that is very competitive, very in which a great premium is placed on hard work and rigorous scholarship. But to be able to create these spaces, such as the courtyard that exists between Annabelle Taylor Hall and Myron Taylor Hall, where the law school is, we had created in the chapel in Annabelle Taylor Hall, we had created a sort of a meditative space for reflection, and we also helped to create a space on North Campus where first year in first year new students who are transferring to Cornell State. And but that was sort of symbolic of what you were talking about in terms of the Floyd Memorial. You know, I think that's important. But as I also think too, it provides an opportunity to see the humanity in others, as we've been talking about, and perhaps, you know, provide the impetus to engage people different from ourselves. You know, there's an old saying that the pastor that I worked with in San Francisco, Dr. Amos Brown, who is still pastor of that congregation now after 45 years, he used to say, he would quote, he said, you know, we hate each other because we do not know each other. We do not know each other because we do not talk to one another. And how communication can be a window, a bridge across not only difference, but divisiveness, and the ways in which division is so manufactured in this culture, whether politically or socially in other ways. But that can be a way that can set the groundwork for, you know, bridging gaps, of repairing breaches.
Yeah, I think in my own life, you know, coming from a more conservative place in the country, right, and thinking about the different political stances of some people in my own family, right, and other people that are very close to me, you know, and it was sad in so many cases, not necessarily those particular individuals, but just watching the news. I think at some point I just stopped watching it. Literally, the mental impacts of that were so negative that I just, you know, it was never, I mean, news is never positive anyway, most of the time, but it seemed it was extra vicious and extra, you know, vile at certain points. And so I couldn't agree more that communication piece, that if we can sit down and talk and not politicize, like, the humanity of people, right? And remember that, again, we all are human, which I think is probably one of the most important lessons that would be good for us to take away as a community, right? To understand that if we want to be understood, we have to be willing to understand. Right. And it takes vulnerability and it takes space. And so having people who can facilitate conversations like this, and, you know, the Office of Human Rights and you know, being able to provide places like that on campus is really important. Those safe spaces where people can talk and work through things and see what we have more in common than the differences. Right.
And I think that's right, because when you dehumanize people in groups, then you can do anything to them. When you seek to erase their humanity, whether they are people of color, whether they are LGBTQ persons, whether they are, you know, from other underserved or vulnerable communities, when you render people as things and not human beings, you can justify the most heinous of actions.
Yeah, no, when you strip people of their humanity, you good people say, do, and believe things, and tolerate things being done to that group, them, right, in ways that they never would have if it was someone that they knew or they had the connection with them. And I think it's an important, in history, we've seen that lesson in history, right, and it's devastating. You know, it's a catastrophe. And so we want to make sure that, I think, having that conversation and remembering that if history repeats itself, if we don't learn from it. So we want to make sure that in every facet of life, and I think, you know, with the George Floyd murder and, you know, the LGBTQ plus populations and just in BIPOC communities and just the experience that they have on the day to day, it's important that we continue to show the light, continue to have the conversations, continue to push those forward, you know, and continue to hold those in power accountable. And you know, and then come together and make sure that everybody's on the same page and find solutions that work for everyone, right? I think that's important. So, Hierald, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
I have a few thoughts, but I am curious if there's anyone that is watching us, if there are any thoughts that folks may have in response to the question that we posed around what have we learned, I mean, going forward. I haven't seen anyone post anything new. But one of the things that I thought of as I heard Dr. Clark, that I think is a tension that I've seen within my particular community is like this. There's an understanding, right? We understand our common humanity, and at the same time, it's really hard to navigate our common humanity when you are constantly being dehumanized. So we've internalized that within ourselves, right? But then, I think about, speaking for myself, of the context that I find myself in, right? I live in an area where it's likely that I will see a lot more political signs that lean a particular way, likely towards sort of the support of someone that was president for 4 years. And that's, in my experience, it's hard to take in, right? It's hard to drive around and be like, wait, am I going to be okay? Right? So that constant negotiating of whether or not you will be okay. So that goes back to, how are our spaces cultivating a sense of resiliency, cultivating a sense of belongingness, right? Cultivating a sense of worth, of beauty, and so I think we're lacking. I think our institutions in particular are lacking in their ability to recognize the importance of that necessity, right? Of that, the ways that spaces play a significant factor in how we relate to ourselves and to each other. So I think, going back to the George Floyd Memorial, I think that over a year, right? I think that there's been something beautiful in that space where, and at the same time, there's tension, right? Where the city of Minneapolis is not always on the same page on maintaining the memorial, right? Because it's an obstruction. It prevents traffic from moving. And so there have been caretakers that took over that space over the last year who have maintained the space as a community space. So, I mean, that's another question for us, right, in our context, right? Who are our community caretakers that are maintaining the space? How are we supporting them? And how are we responding when those efforts may come at odds with the city, maybe at odds with other invested powers, right? Maybe at odds with the new building that may be coming up, right? Those are the realities that I think we live at. And those are questions that I have, right? As I think about space in particular. But someone from the chat shared, I've learned that cultural humility is needed to create an inclusive and equitable society. And I think that's spot on. It's a really good way to frame that.
I agree. Oh, go ahead, Kate. You go ahead.
No, go for it. I was going to say something else. Go for it. You're fine.
You sure? Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I think, that I think that's a really good statement, because, cultural humility, I think, is more important to pursue than, say, cultural competence. I think, and there is a difference in that. I have a daughter who's a social worker and who's done presentations on cultural humility versus cultural, or vis-a-vis cultural competence, and how we have to, part of that requires us to be in community with others whose culture and whose experience, whose lives, whose realities are different from our own. It's entering into that space with questions more than assertions or assumptions, and it requires a good bit of listening as well. So I think that is a very important value to pursue, You know, and you know, humility can help us to learn how to navigate those spaces and in ways in which we find ourselves, you know, constantly being, you know, on a quest for learning and understanding. As a seeker, as a, you know, as another human being, and all of us kind of reflect a certain particularity of experiences or social, cultural, political, and other locations, and that, you know, we can engage one another, I think, in terms of where those places intersect and where they may diverge through cultural humility.
I was thinking just sort of about creating those spaces, and I think, you know, working for the county, you know, looking out, seeing the pride flags flying on the at the flagpoles, right? Is not everyone has that experience. And as I walked in today and I thought about it, I'm glad that I'm able to work for an employer that holds space for that, right? And I know after the George Floyd murder and you know the attacks on the Capitol and some different things, the county really was pretty intentional about kind of pushing the pause button and holding space for employees to come in and talk, and be able to have those spaces and work through that process, and grieve, right? And so I think, kind of going back to the lessons, I think the employers and people who watch that, not just in our private spaces, but it's important for our employers, right? And people in all places, whether that's higher education or, you know, the high schools, to remember that we have responsibility in places of leadership to hold space for people to be able to do those things, right? And that, you know, just being humble. I think that, you know, be humble, be kind, right? It seems like you know, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, the golden rule, right? I think that the things that we need to remember are so simple, right? That it's not, we oftentimes make things so complex. And if we can just remember to be humble and listen to other people and their experiences, right? It may be different from ours, but it to validate that through hearing and actually listening to it, I think is important. So, you know, because it hits us all, right?
I was just reading, there's nothing new from the chat either, but I did want to put a plug in for those that are joining us to fill out the Google form if you want to be entered into the raffle as well. I see from Dominic.
Yeah, Annie Corbin wrote that she gained some strengths in coming out to her family, pushing for the rights, and being out a public person helped her get through the pandemic. You know, I think we've come so far, right? You know, thinking back to the AIDS pandemic, thinking back to all the challenges, whether it's Stonewall, you know, or whatever it's been, our communities have come through so much, right? And I think we owe a great debt to those that came before us, but not forgetting that we are strong, right? We've pushed through, we've done this, we've emerged on the other side stronger. And I think that is something to be celebrated, right? So many times we talk about some of the sad things that we learn, but also just the strength and resiliency. You know, we need to make space to celebrate and reflect, yes, but also celebrate those wins, you know, and the strength and the good things that have come out of our lives because of it.
And to celebrate those wins every day, not just during Pride Month.
Yes, Pride Month needs to be 12 months out of the year, right?
Months, every day, yes.
Every day, right?
Do you want to move on to some of the two last questions that we had talked through? I think we've touched on them somehow through our conversation so far. But
sure, yeah.
One of the questions that we were thinking for those in the audience, from BIPOC communities in particular, if you could share how you've experienced the pandemic, if there's anything that you would want to add to this conversation. and I shared briefly, sort of from my own particular experience, kind of the striking reality, just in terms of my family, right? Immigrant family, Latino family, not working from home for the entirety of the pandemic, right? And having to navigate the reality of going out into the world daily and the fear of whether or not something would happen. And then it did. And that was also terrifying, because I remember when my parents and my brother had COVID, it wasn't a natural thing for them to think about having Instacart be an option. Like it wasn't a part of their imagination, because it wasn't a thing they did, right? And so, and my mother doesn't speak English either, so and she doesn't use computers. She just recently did Google Chat and the Google video thing, and barely can get through that. But I was like, wow, like I've depended in, social locations, right? I'm a college graduate. My mother's not. I'm very versed in Instacart and how to utilize these options that became available because of the pandemic. And then to realize that, oh, wait, it's not a reality for everyone. And so like I figured out how to get Instacart for my parents because they needed stuff and they couldn't leave their house, right? And so I'm like, wow, like imagine like how many other folks in the world and in these contexts, how do they navigate these discrepancies and realities that affected their day to day? So that was real. But also like even like the disregard, I think, within my parents' experience and their employer too, for their health and well-being, right? Like profit over people was like clearly present in how they were asked to still show up to work. And like my mother in particular, when I asked like, are you getting paid? And she's like, nope, we have, and they couldn't work because they had COVID, right? So then loss of income, not knowing how to navigate these things that became available to the pandemic, having to really get better enough, right, to go back to work, because the longer it was, the longer they were without income. So that was my own personal reality within the pandemic. But I don't know if anyone has shared. I haven't seen anything come through, but
yeah, I think it. I think I learned. I didn't know that. I didn't know much, right, about some things. I think I learned I know less than I thought I did maybe at the beginning of COVID, right, and people's different experiences. And I learned an appreciation for that. Again, just that listening part. And I think the other thing too is that as we emerge out of the shadows of COVID, right, I don't think we've yet seen the full impacts of what is yet to come, right? Whether that's social anxiety or it's the health that will follow, the health issues that may follow, as we begin to get back into whatever the normal will look like. So I think that's also another thing. It's like these lessons that it's not like COVID's now over, right? And I think those who are disproportionately impacted, anytime there's a crisis, right? You begin to see the difference in those that have and those do not, right? Or have access to resources or don't. From simple things like the ability to access the internet, right? Kids staying home from school, right? What did distance learning look like, right? And how, in some cases, they lost the entire year because maybe they were trying to access it through a prepaid cell phone, right? And I think it really just continues to show us that we need to continue to bring these issues forward, and create space for people who don't have voices or have had so many experiences that they don't feel that using their voice is, they're not able to do so. And it'll be interesting to see the impacts as we go through the next year. What shakes out in some of this. So
one of the things I think that helped me in terms of resilience, well, I thought about my grandmother. My grandmother was born in Virginia in 1887 and moved to Baltimore at 16 in 1903. and she found work as a domestic worker. And she worked in the houses of white persons in East and South Baltimore. She moved, as did a great many Black women in the early 20th century, from a rural setting to the city, because Black women were able to get work prior to World War I in urban centers with more regularity than Black men. She lived through the 1918 pandemic. She lost a son in that pandemic, an uncle I never got a chance to meet. She was also living in a very segregated Baltimore, a Baltimore without Jim Crow signs, but that was as rigidly segregated as any place south of the Mason-Dixon line. It was a Baltimore in which she could not gain entry to the world famous Johns Hopkins Hospital at that time because she was Black. She would have had to go to Providence Hospital, the historic Black hospital in Baltimore, perhaps maybe even Franklin Square Hospital, the hospital I was born in West Baltimore. Two hospitals that, had historically served Black people. So I think about what she endured during that pandemic compared to what inconveniences I've had in this pandemic, which in certain ways are relative compared to what she endured. The 1918 pandemic happened, 2 years before the advent of commercial radio. There were telephones, telegraphs, and that was it. We have, we're on Zoom right now. We can use, as you said, Instacart. I mean, it helps me to put things in some perspective. I'm not downplaying the suffering and the struggle at all that has happened during this pandemic. People have lost jobs. They have been socially and economically dislocated. There are people who are wondering what they will do when the moratoriums on rent end. And there has been some real struggle. But it also helps me in terms of looking back at what I think about what my grandmother endured. And she came through this and she lived 92 years and she lived long enough to be able to receive care at Hopkins. That is the hospital she died in. So that's what sort of gives me some sense of resiliency. That sort of hope that emerges out of struggle to think about as we get through this and in particular, as we work with communities that have been adversely affected by this pandemic in multiple ways.
Yeah, I just sort of thinking back of what it must have been like to live through that 1918 pandemic, just not being able to talk about isolation, right? What it must have looked like to the people who have experienced it, and sort of it would be very interesting if you could go back and sort of have another perspective of what that went through and what they thought were remedies, and the loss that they felt. I think it was a very different world, right? Very different world.
So I think Dominic left us a message okay. And so we are just about at our closing moment. And I want to thank those of you who joined us today. I want to especially thank our very able co-moderators, Kate and Hierald, for their wonderful contributions and the ways in which they sort of kept this conversation going. You will be, for those of you who submitted your emails for the raffle, Dominic Recchio, our communications director for the county, will email you to let you know whether or not you won in the raffle or what you won in the raffle. And we will be in touch with you about this. We'd hope to announce the winners before the end, but we will email you with the winning results for the raffle. But thank you so much for your time and for your attention today. We hope you enjoyed the rest of Pride Month, and hope that this program was of benefit and support and encouragement to you. Thank you, and